Now it's time for us to start talking about the Hellenistic age. Again, as I mentioned before, when we say Hellenistic, you should think Greek-like, like the Greeks. So the Hellenistic age, this is the age where Greek thought begins to sort of spread around. Okay, so Macedonia was part of the Greek world, but the Greeks still saw themselves as being better even than these Greeks. So some Greeks are better than other Greeks, at least in their minds. Whoops. This mostly had to do with the lack of Macedonian unification to Greek political ideals. Macedonia had a coastal plain on the Aegean Sea to the south and east. The interior was nothing but mountains, but these mountains were filled with gold and silver, timber, and precious metals. So while it is very difficult to unite the population due to its geography and the people remain very tribal, the Greeks are looking down on them. They want the resources, right? So this is going to cause trouble. Those that lived in the mountains could not be subdued by the Macedonian kings, and the country suffered several invasions. And because of their lack of unification, they're really not able to fight off the Greeks to the south, who saw Macedonia as a place only good for its natural resources. In approximately 359 BCE, Philip II rose up as king of Macedonia. After fighting in some of the various Greek wars during the 4th century, he was captured and held as a POW, which stands for prisoner of war, in Thebes for about 3 years. While there, he learned in great detail about Greek politics and warfare. After his release, he taught the Macedonian people what he knew and then used this knowledge as a weapon against the Greeks. In fact, Philip turned out to be a military genius. For example, the Greeks fought with swords, shields, and 9-foot-long pikes. Okay, so that's like a really, really long, you can see in this picture, it's a really, 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 really long spear. Okay, that's what a pike is. They fought in very tight battle formations called a phalanx. The phalanx was about 8 men deep and as wide as they had men to fill the ranks. Philip, however, looked at it and said, we can use this a little bit differently and it's going to work to our advantage. He gave his men 13 feet long pikes and ordered them to spread out a little more. Then throughout the phalanx were other foot soldiers who were lightly armed with like bows and arrows, javelins, slings, things of that nature. Although this phalanx innovation was ingenious, the Macedonian cavalry really made the difference in every battle. The extra long pikes kept the enemy further away, and the mounted warriors could flank them. They could come in from the side, giving way to the lightly armed foot soldiers to take out any of those left standing. Philip is also credited with developing new siege weapons. In particular, he developed the torsion catapult, which used twisted ropes as a means of exerting more force. In about 338 BCE, Philip conquered the Greek peninsula, with the exception of Sparta. Instead of charging the Greeks a tribute, so instead of making them pay, he made them his allies, and he did not allow them to wage war on each other. His plan was to invade the Persian Empire. Okay, so this is what he wants to do. He wants to take the fight to the Persians, but he really didn't. He didn't get to see that happen. He was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, and nobody knows the exact reason why. There's no evidence to show one reason or another, but it is possible it was a conspiracy. However, unless archaeologists find some fantastic document, we really will never know. But that stated, after his assassination, his son, Alexander, takes up the mantle of leadership. Alexander was reared specifically for this moment. Philip taught him everything he needed to know for leading an army, and brought in Aristotle to be his teacher. Okay, so Aristotle is the personal teacher to Alexander the Great. Although we don't know for sure what Aristotle taught Alexander, we can guess that more than likely he imparted a love for everything Greek, including philosophy. The only thing Aristotle probably taught, which Alexander seemingly refused, was the notion that all non-Greeks were barbarians. I mean, you have to remember that Alexander is, he's Greek, but he's Macedonian. So, if Aristotle brought this idea to Alexander, Alexander was brought up with the idea of, hey, the Greeks are pompous and they think themselves better, but they're not. So, yeah. Alexander was a ruthless warrior. He secured his rule over his father's kingdom by basically squashing any city or region that even hinted at revolting. In 334, he implemented his father's plan of invading Persia. He had several small victories, and then at the Battle of Issus, he defeated a Persian force twice as large as his. He then captured several coastal cities to protect himself from the Persian navy. He continued to show his family's legacy of military genius by improving Philip's catapults and adding siege towers to his arsenal. Alexander conquered Egypt and went on to establish the city of Alexandria as a cosmopolitan center there. Something that's kind of fun is that most cities he established were named Alexandria. But this is the one that really that took. So, let's see. Where was I? Oh, in 331, Alexander met the Persian king again, and he was again outnumbered. Alexander's great military strategy, once again, came in to save the day, and he forced gaps in the Persian line, and the cavalry moved in for the kill. Then in 330 BCE, Alexander moved further south and captured the Persian capital of Persepolis. All these great victories more than likely went to his head, and he claimed to be descended from both Achilles and Hercules. He wanted to keep moving in order to conquer more land, but by this time his troops said, you know what, no, we're done, and they basically mutinied. But in order to keep everybody in check, he decided that he would turn around and start heading back. So you can see all of the land in green. This is Alexander's empire. This is massive. Once again, this is the largest empire to date in the ancient world. Although he fought a lot, Alexander had to govern his growing empire. He established different policies that have received both praise and criticism. One was his policy of establishing urban centers in which Greek colonists and Greek ways of life were integrated. Another policy was that of intermarriage. He encouraged his troops to marry local women that they conquered. The last policy, or at least the last one of note that I'm going to mention, is that of adding conquered people to his army. At one time, according to some documents, he chose 30,000 young Asian boys to be taught the Greek language and Macedonian warfare in order to ensure the empire's future fighting force. Whatever his intentions were, he infused Greek culture into every land he conquered. In 323 BCE, Alexander suddenly died at the age of 32. The evidence available to us implies that he died either from alcohol abuse or alcohol poisoning, from a fever. We're not exactly sure. After the onset of his illness, it was several days before he died, so it seems more than likely that it could have been alcohol issues. They were known, he and his men were known for drinking a lot. And anyway, but it is also possible it could have been a fever from the region. It could have possibly been a heart attack. Maybe he had an injury that festered, got infected, and ultimately caused his death. We're really not sure. But we do know that his illness set in immediately after a banquet in which he was drinking a lot. So that's where the idea that possibly it was alcohol poisoning. Sometime after Alexander's death, his wife and young son were murdered, and the generals that fought with Alexander divided the empire into smaller kingdoms. and these men began taking control of the smaller areas. Ptolemy took the region of Egypt, that which is in green there. Seleucus took Asia, the largest portion, also the most spread out, and that's in the sort of the yellowish color. And Antigonus, the one-eyed, I mentioned him just because he's called Antigonus the one-eyed, because he only had, one eye. Anyway, I find that funny. And he took Greece. The others we're really not going to discuss. Ptolemy, probably the more famous of the rulers, took Alexander's remains with him to Egypt and buried Alexander in the city of Alexandria. The Ptolemies wound up ruling Egypt for the next 300 years as both Egyptian and Greek. They never let go of their Greek heritage, and for years this worked pretty well, but eventually it definitely can cause some trouble here and there. There were several distinctions of the Ptolemaic rulers, but the most important was the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone was a decree that established Ptolemy V as the rightful king of Egypt. Now, this in and of itself is not really a big deal, but what makes it a big deal is that the stone is inscribed with 3 different written languages: hieroglyphics, Egyptian cursive, and Greek. This artifact enabled scholars in the 1800s to finally understand hieroglyphics. Without it, we probably, there's a very real chance, very real possibility that we still would not be able to read ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. So this is an incredibly, incredibly important document from the ancient world. Seleucus stole Babylon's treasury in 311 BCE, giving him the power over the heart of the Persian Empire. That stated, this part of the empire did not remain fully intact. By the 3rd century, he lost India and Eastern Asia Minor. The Seleucids founded many cities and brought as many as 20,000 Greeks and Macedonians to colonize the areas. The major Seleucid cities were able to control the trade going over the Tigris and the Euphrates valleys, and they eventually became important political and economic centers as well. The Macedonian settlers saw themselves as conquerors, very, very similar to the Greeks here. They see themselves very much as superior, and the Seleucid kings gave them lots of farmland as well as loopholes. Some did not have to pay taxes, and others were given food until the first harvest came in, which ultimately is going to cause the locals to starve, right? The locals ultimately are enslaved or mistreated in other ways. Many of the colonists coming from Macedonia and Greece did not work their own land. So this definitely gives rise to the ideas that the Greeks are large and in charge, as it were. I make myself laugh. Okay. Antigonus, the one-eyed, didn't really win any great victories, so he did not gain any major territory. Until his death, he never gained a firm hand over Macedonia. However, his descendants eventually took control, and they established the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia and Greece. For several generations, Macedonia did not change. Greece, on the other hand, changed rather rapidly under Antigonid rule. Democracy, for the most part, disappeared. Many jobs began to have specialists instead of being open for anyone to compete in. So that idea of arete, suddenly competition, individual competition starts to move away. There's a huge gap appearing between the rich and the poor, meaning that the rich began to have much more power. And again, like in the earliest days, we see the rich neglecting the poor once again. As the East meets the West, armies begin to change. Instead of consisting mostly of citizen soldiers, kind of like what we see, now, mercenaries filled the ranks. So this is different from what we have now, right? Mercenaries are hired guns, okay? These guys have no loyalty except to the person who's going to pay them the most and pay them on time. They frequently swap sides depending on payment, and for the most part, mercenaries wreak havoc almost everywhere they go because, again, they have no loyalty to anyone. During the wars which take place after Alexander's death, the war elephant began to take a prominent role. Asian elephants were treasured as vastly important elements of an arsenal. They would take part in battles by trampling people or by slinging their tusks around, as well as dragging siege towers, siege weapons, and other large things. The Seleucid kings cut off the trade in war elephants, so the Ptolemies had to rely on the smaller African elephants, which didn't quite do the job. But in either case, elephants were incredibly good to use simply as beasts of burden if they couldn't be used in the battles themselves. During this time, we do see a rise in slavery, and the Greek notion, the ancient Greeks had a notion of offering slaves some sort of freedom, or at least of a decent living. That ultimately goes away. So although the Greeks are taking their culture across the known land, this diffusion of cultures, this cultural interaction, there's very much a shift in values taking place. Women, on the other hand, did see a rise in new freedoms, and they were more free to move about in the public spaces and participate in many different avenues, like music and poetry and art and whatnot. As the new territories began to grow, excuse me, the Hellenistic kingdom stimulated the West economy. Greek became the universal language of business. Standardized currency showed up, and Alexandria soon replaced Athens as the center for commercialism. Increased trade led to new developments in agriculture, and soon people began experimenting with spices, with cross-pollinating plants, growing crops in regions where they'd never been grown before. And kings began levying taxes on imports and exports, which eventually led to politicians all speaking Greek. So Greek is the language of business and suddenly starts to become the language of politics. Kings began using all this new money that they're taking in on warring against each other and on other nations. With all these cities springing up, urban centers began to experience a lot of problems as well. Problems including feeding all the new people. Governments suddenly saw the need to import many supplies to provide for their citizens. Cities were filthy. There was a constant struggle for proper sewage and water drainage. Public safety was definitely of concern, but mostly to the citizens. The government hired just a few night watchmen, but other than that, you were for the most part on your own. So theft, murder, and other crimes were frequent in the cities. I mentioned women a little bit earlier. Women are still not as highly prized as men. Infant exposure is definitely higher with girls, but we do start to see women come up with some more freedoms during this time. Art becomes more lifelike to depict real human emotion. So whereas before, what we saw in Greece with we're going to portray only that which is beautiful, now you see things, examples such as like down here on the bottom, this is a statue of an old beggar woman. She's not considered beautiful. She's not young, and she's not wealthy. She's not well dressed. She's not well taken care of, and yet an artist sees her as an object of artistic expression, and so art begins to change. There is a movement to Hellenize the Jews, particularly among the Seleucids in Asia, but we see it under the Ptolemies as well. So let's talk about that for a little bit. Judea remained independent under Alexander and the Ptolemies. However, in the major urban centers, many Jews struggled against Hellenization, or the making of themselves like the Greeks, because they saw the dangers in straying too far away from the law, that is, the law, what we find like in the Old Testament of the Christian Bible. So they saw dangers in moving too far away from the law in everyday life when dealing with those who did not worship Yahweh. Some of them took advantage of Hellenization and that they learned to speak and write Greek. In the 3rd century, the Hebrew scripture was translated to Greek, and in many synagogues, they were read in Greek rather than in the original Hebrew. So we're starting to see a change taking place among the Jews and in Jewish culture. In 200 BCE, the Seleucids took Palestine from the Ptolemies, and the Hebrew people faced much greater opposition to them keeping their law and their traditions. Antiochus IV did what he could to force Hellenization among the Jewish people. He placed Greek schools in Jerusalem. He entered Jewish people into Greek-style athletic events, but he went way too far when he erected an altar to Zeus in the temple of God and then sacrificed to Zeus on it with a pig considered an unclean animal by the law. When the second temple in Jerusalem was looted and services stopped, Judaism was outlawed. Antiochus went on to ban circumcision and ordered pigs to be sacrificed once again at the altar of the temple. By 165 BCE, the Jewish revolt against the Seleucid monarchy was successful. The temple was liberated and rededicated, and the festival of Hanukkah was instituted to celebrate this event. The revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes is recorded by the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, among other sources, and we see a guy by the name of Judah the Maccabee, meaning the hammer, leading the revolt. At first, it's his dad with his 4 brothers, but over time, Judah becomes sort of the leader of the revolt, and it's referred to as the Maccabean Revolt. So it's during this time when we see the introduction of the holiday Hanukkah. According to the Talmud, olive oil was needed for the menorah in the temple, which was required to burn throughout the night, every night. So the story goes that there was only enough oil to burn for 1 day, yet it burned for 8 days, the time needed to prepare a fresh supply of oil for the menorah. Judah had ordered the temple to be cleansed and a new altar to be built in place of the polluted one and new holy vessels to be made. So they need oil in order as part of this cleansing process, this purification process. So an 8-day festival was declared by the Jewish sages to commemorate the miracle. And this is where we see the feast, once again, of Hanukkah, which is a celebration of gladness and joy. And part of the Hanukkah, once again, we have the menorah with the candles that are lit for each day of the holiday. During this time, once again, there is a diffusion of culture which is taking place, and the Greeks developed 3 schools of philosophical thought that we actually still see today, and all of them were established as a means of gaining some sort of spiritual satisfaction. Cynicism was established by a guy named Diogenes, and this was the thought that the only way to be truly happy was to reject everything in the world: money, power, property, family ties, religion, comfort, anything that can be gotten rid of, they should get rid of it, because they thought if they did this, they could achieve spiritual happiness and fulfillment. Epicureanism, established by a guy named Epicurus, he followed the philosopher Democritus, the guy who said that the universe was made up of tiny atoms that randomly float around and collide with each other. His thought was that a life of moderation was the key to happiness. So seeking pleasure was good, but do so without going overboard in anything so that you don't feel any pain. The point of Epicureanism was to avoid pain as much as possible. And then we have Stoicism. A guy by the name of Zeno established this school of thought. At first he followed cynicism, but he felt that material possessions were okay as long as you were not attached to them. So then he developed the argument for a God that governed the universe with established laws and structures. The Stoics believed everything had a reason. They taught to not fight the structure, just go with it. When pain and suffering comes, don't get angry, don't complain, don't fuss, just endure it. Just don't fight it. So if somebody breaks into your house and takes stuff, that's fine. Let them take it. If they, want to rape your wife, whatever, go ahead. That's, Stoicism. The world is rational with laws and structures. Don't fight it because you can't. So these are the new philosophies that people are coming up with. And what's fun is that you can see in the scriptures Paul going to debate the different philosophers, the Cynics and the Stoics in particular, there in the book of Acts. With this religious diversity, we start to see the deification of kings, which means that kings start to call themselves gods, right? So whenever we get to like Julius Caesar, he's not just Caesar, he's not just emperor, he is a god. Cults stress good relationships between peoples and deities, and guess what? That's going to include the kings eventually, right? We've got to have a good relationship between ourselves and our deities, going back to that ancient Greek idea of impiety can anger the gods, so we must have a good relationship between us and the deities. And we also see faith in divine healing. All of these things, it is not an accident that all of these things are coming just before the time whenever the Romans are going to assume control, and underneath the Roman Empire we will have Jesus, the Son of God, born. So all of this, we want to keep this sort of in the back of our minds whenever Jesus the Christ is born, and just to help us to better understand what he is teaching, or how he is teaching, and what he's teaching against, because all of this comes into play. This marks the end, basically, of the Hellenistic lecture that I teach like in my classrooms, because this really is sort of, for me, this is a jumping off point to get straight into Rome. So our next lecture, we are going to be starting with Rome.